So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Paula. Thank you to my friends and colleagues for coming on a really busy Friday. So my presentation today is on the place of gender in what was the largest private sector investment on the African continent, and that was the Chad-Cameroon pipeline project. This pipeline and other extractive industry projects have come to drive foreign direct investment, private investment in Africa. And as that's happened, both global oil companies and the international banks that finance these projects have tried to position them as development projects. And this particular project was a really interesting one to study because the World Bank described it as a model for natural resource-driven development. It was supposed to be a template for other extractive industry projects on the continent because it combined efforts to integrate Chad into the global economy through the development of its oil industry with a comprehensive package of good governance initiatives that were supposed to ensure that the oil revenues that went to Chad would be used for poverty reduction. So gender is strikingly absent in the hundreds of thousands of pages of plans and policies and documentation on the project. And feminist scholars have argued that gender disappears from these discussions about global economic integration because these discussions tend to focus on the macroeconomic impacts of globalization while ignoring its material effects, its relational effects, or at least assuming that those effects are similar for men and women. And this was certainly the case with this project. Most of the attention that this project generated in the media and elsewhere was focused on a novel revenue management plan that was supposed to help Chad beat the resource curse, which is a well-known curse in the extractive industries. And in the oilfield region, it was focused on a whole package of social and environmental risk mitigation strategies that the oil companies described as gender neutral. So in the archive of this project, gender is virtually invisible. And so what I want to argue is that the invisibility of gender was not an oversight. It wasn't something that just happened. It wasn't an accident. It was actually a strategic move on the part of oil companies that allowed them to streamline their operations and to move this project forward really efficiently. So gender doesn't just fall out of the picture. It takes a lot of work to actually make gender disappear. And the second part of my argument, which is more empirical, and you will see it's less complete, is that the policies that made gender invisible actually had very gendered effects. And in particular, they concentrated land in men's hands and increased women's dependence on men for access to land. And I want to talk about how that happened through the figures of the baou déné and the baou mosso. And so in Ngambai, which is a local language, baou is someone who is wealthy or who has a lot of money. Oh, why is that moving forward? I'm not there yet. So baou is someone who has a lot of things. Déné is the term for woman. So the baou déné were, they're now old women, but they're women who were once legendary for being successful female farmers. And the baou mosso are women who engage in small trade, but they regularly fall down. And so mosso is the term, it means to fall down. In this sense, it means to go broke. So baou mosso is to have things and then to go broke, or to get up and then to fall down. And the term conveys the inability of women who are now dependent on small trade to accumulate wealth. So I'm sorry, if you get bored listening to me, you can watch trees being cut down. So just to be very brief about setting the scene, this project was a partnership between a consortium of global oil companies that was led by ExxonMobil, the governments of Chad and Cameroon, and the World Bank. The oil fields are located in the Doba Basin region, which is in the southwest corner of Chad, just to the east of Cameroon, just north of the Central African Republic. And the consortium estimated that they operated in an area that was roughly 400 square miles. That's about 100,000 hectares. And this is a very rural agricultural zone where nearly everyone makes a living from farming, supplemented by small informal trade. Yeah, you have to come closer. Sorry.
Lori,
Yeah.
can we ask questions on the fly? Or do you want to-
Sure. Dan, I don't know.
Sure.
How you
Yeah, were people compensated? That's a huge right-of-way that you have on the map. Was that land purchased by?
Yes, and I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So unlike many women in the Global South, which the students who are here from my class will know, African women have been affected by globalization mostly at home as farmers and as small traders. And women in the oil field region were no exception. The major impact of this project on them was the loss of thousands of hectares of agricultural land. This project was not a classic case of enclave extraction. Oil companies actually prefer to work in places where there are no people, or to clear people off the land before they begin a project, which is why offshoring is their preferred mode of operating. But in Chad, this wasn't possible. And so project infrastructure was scattered throughout the oil field region, and it was located to avoid breaching villages. But what that meant was that it was sited, it was located on the agricultural land in between their villages. The project has continued to expand in size over time. It now includes 7 oil wells instead of the initial 3. 7 oil fields instead of the initial 3, and about 1,000 wells, whereas the initial plan was for 280. And that's because production has been much lower than the consortium anticipated. The oil is a very heavy oil, it's a very viscous oil. It is a very poor quality oil that actually requires very specialized refining facilities to process. It can only be processed at a couple of different places in the world. It's called the challenged crude. And so it trades at a very significant discount on global oil markets. So as the project has expanded to increase the volume of production to make up for these kinds of problems, the consortium has expropriated about 6,000 hectares of agricultural land in the oil field region. This is an area where land pressure was already severe before the project began, and expropriations continue. Okay, so I mentioned before that the consortium adopted a suite of social and environmental standards to mitigate the effects of the project on people in the region. And the most important part of that standards regime for my purposes today, which relates to Tom's question, was something called the Compensation and Resettlement Plan. And this was a plan that described how the consortium would take people's land, how it would compensate them, and how it would resettle them. And in creating this plan, the consortium broke from earlier models of involuntary resettlement. The World Bank assigns responsibility to the borrower or to the project operator, so in this case, ExxonMobil, for rehabilitating people who are displaced or who are adversely affected by development projects. And in the development era, nation states were the typical borrowers, right? As they took on these nation-building projects, they built dams and power plants and highways and infrastructure. And they treated resettlement as a long-term social contract, right? I'm not saying that those resettlement projects were successful. In fact, nearly all of them were colossal failures. But nation states treated displaced populations as groups in need of assistance and as entitled to long-term support and assistance. Michael Cernia was the chief architect of the World Bank's resettlement policies, and he describes resettlement using language like a social project, a truly extraordinary burden, right? Something that requires long-term engagement and a commitment to a kind of social engineering. The consortium's compensation and resettlement programs look nothing like this, right? And I can't go into a lot of detail here, but I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. When farmers lost their land, they received a one-time lump sum cash payment, and it was their responsibility to find a different plot of land to farm and to reestablish themselves by the next agricultural season. If they lost a critical proportion of their land, they were enrolled in a short-term training program, mostly to learn a technical trade. And they were again responsible for finding another job or another source of income that would allow them to recover. There was no effort to resettle farmers who lost land. If they wanted to move, they were expected to self-resettle. To move without the assistance of the consortium or the assistance of the state or the assistance of NGOs. And the consortium normalized self-resettlement by saying, oh, this is something that people here do all the time. So one of the key points here is that the consortium described these programs, these policies, as gender neutral. It said that both men and women farmed, and because of that, it could operate in a way that was gender blind, right? It wouldn't have to make special provisions for female farmers or even pay attention to gender. So the only point I want to make here is that global oil companies are not nation states, and the consortium's interests were not exactly aligned with the World Bank's, in the sense that the consortium was not invested in the development project of the World Bank. It was interested in getting oil out of the ground expeditiously, and it used the standards regime and the standard on involuntary resettlement as a tool for doing this. So Jamie Cross, who is an anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh, has argued that standards are technologies that allow companies to delimit their ongoing obligations and attachments to suppliers who are part of their global supply chains, and to redistribute responsibilities within those supply chains. And here, the consortium used the standards regime to circumscribe its obligations to farmers and to devolve responsibility to them for their own recovery and their own rehabilitation. So global oil companies don't want to form binding attachments to farmers who supply them with land, and they don't want to commit to the kinds of long-term social projects that Michael Cernia and the World Bank were talking about. And making gender go away was a critical part of its strategy to streamline its operations and to distance and detach. Now, that move to make gender invisible still required a lot of work. And here I'm going to take a lot of shortcuts again in describing that work to you. The consortium's formulation of the gender order was shaped by the work of Ellen Patterson Brown, who was an anthropologist of southern Chad. She was hired by the consortium to help them develop the compensation and resettlement plan. She was a former Peace Corps volunteer. She had worked for USAID and CARE as an applied anthropologist. She spoke the local language. ExxonMobil always took pictures of her looking like an anthropologist, sitting on the ground. And one of the projects that she worked on prior to working for the oil companies was a comparative study of how different ethnic groups in Chad responded to the famines of the 1980s. And what she found was that Sara households, and the Sara are the sort of the umbrella ethnic group in the south, including families in the oilfield region, were able to recover much more quickly than other groups. And she attributed that to the ability of Sara women to farm independently and to perform all of the tasks that men performed. Right? And these kinds of anthropological accounts about women figured prominently in the compensation and resettlement plan. But these claims about women as farmers also have to be historicized. Women were able to farm like men and even to turn into men, to change into men, in her language, because of particular colonial and ecological legacies that I want to talk about just briefly. So, colonial administrations throughout Francophone Africa seized land that they described as empty or unused, which of course were not really empty or unused. They seized that land for the state in order to give the land to concessionary companies that could support the colonial administration. And the problem was that none of those concessionary companies came to Chad. Because no one came to Chad, the colonial authorities implemented a policy of mandatory cotton cultivation, in which each able-bodied adult was obligated to grow a cord of cotton. So the local unit of land in southern Chad is not, it's not the hectare, it's actually the cord, which refers to a rope or a cord, la corde in French, where the colonial overseers would come with a cord of a certain dimension and would measure out plots that they then assigned to each person on which they had to grow cotton every year. And this policy, while it was really repressive and reviled, also turned women into landowners. Since in Chad, as in much of sub-Saharan Africa, those who clear land are recognized as having ownership rights in that land. And it also introduced the idea of personal fields, or fields that were cultivated by individual farmers as opposed to household fields farmed collectively for household consumption, right? Since at the end of the season, farmers had to sell their cotton to cotton fran, which later became cotton Chad. So social scientists have typically argued that colonial policies changed the gender order in ways that made men and women more unequal. But in Chad, mandatory cotton cultivation, despite the fact that it was incredibly coercive, actually had the opposite effect. It gave women a way to accumulate wealth and to farm like men. And ultimately, it gave rise to this group of women who were known as the baou déné, who were successful female farmers who were able to accumulate wealth in the form of land and cattle, who were able to expand their families by marrying women for their sons and their nephews. And some of the baou déné were even the primary providers for their families and became some of the wealthiest people, not just the wealthiest women, but the wealthiest people in their villages. So if you go to Canton Miandoum, which is where I work today, you will find many men who live in their mothers' or their grandmothers' villages because this is where they inherited land, despite the fact that in anthropological terms, the Sara are patrilineal, and land is supposed to be passed down through the patriline. The ability of women to work like men, to change into men, was also contingent on a particular local ecology. And people had to regularly clear new plots out of virgin forest since cotton rapidly depletes the soils. And as early as the 1950s, there were French geographers working for the colonial administration that were mapping land use patterns in the cotton growing zone and expressing concern about the rapid pace of deforestation. And in Canton Miandoum, the last tracts of virgin forest were cleared in the early 1980s, just about the time that Ellen Brown was doing her work on her study of famine recovery. And by the time the pipeline project got underway almost 20 years later, in 2000, all of the land had become inherited land, in contrast to this description that she had written just a decade earlier. So what the consortium's claims about women as farmers failed to take into account was that this period from 1930, when mandatory cotton cultivation was introduced, to about 1980, when the forest disappeared, that this was really a remarkable interlude in the history of the rural South in which women had the ability to change into men. And they could do that because of the availability of virgin forest and this very repressive colonial policy of mandatory cotton production that nevertheless allowed them to accumulate wealth in land. So now I turn to what the compensation and resettlement plan, which was supposed to be gender neutral, what it actually did. So first of all, when the project started in 2000, families were already caught in this vicious cycle of declining yields, longer periods of food insecurity that led to more extensive use of land, shorter periods of fallowing that then reinforced the problem of declining yields and food insecurity. So households were pooling the resources of multiple members to make ends meet, and that's now a very common story across most of Africa. Women were really important contributors to household food production. Married women live in their husbands' villages, so they typically farm on land that belongs to their in-laws. And Ellen Brown, the anthropologist, found that 60% of married women were farming independently in the years just before construction on the pipeline started. And while in theory, whoever farms a personal field has discretion over the use of crops, as food shortages have become more acute, women's use of land and women's use of food had become a major source of tension in households. So women are regularly reminded that what they produce on their in-laws' land belongs to their marital families. And they're frequently accused of siphoning food off or stealing small amounts of food, diverting resources to their own families in neighboring villages. And so there were lots of disputes about the allocation of food and resources. And what the project did was it reconfigured and it amplified those concerns about women's allegiances and about who women were really working for by attaching monetary value to land. So the consortium paid the person who was farming the field at the time it took the land. So anyone who farmed a field could, in theory, become baou, could become wealthy overnight. And so married women who farmed their own fields, and actually the fields that actually belonged to their husband's family, came to be viewed with a great deal of suspicion. And these were not just women who might be diverting small amounts of sorghum or millet to their families. They were possible defectors, people who could get these huge windfall compensation payments and leave the village with them and set themselves up at home. So I'm going to show you a very busy table that I'm going to apologize for right now because I haven't had time to make it beautiful. But so there was a kind of moral panic that took hold. And one of the ways this anxiety about women and cash manifested was in claims that women were rushing out to farm personal fields and to position themselves to capture these big cash compensation payments. So we used GIS actually to map how families used land in 2 consecutive agricultural seasons. And since the project started, I've worked primarily in these 3 villages, which were affected to different degrees by land loss. I followed 40 families in Ngalaba, which is the biggest village, 20 in Maikeri and in Bendo. And the unit of land in this table is a plot. It's not a farmer. It's also not the actual square footage in each of these categories. And it's true that not all the fields are exactly the same size, but I think plots are a fairly good proxy, especially since what I'm trying to show you are general patterns. Right, so there are a couple of things that I want to point out in the table. So in all of the villages, a large proportion of the land holdings are put into cultivation in every year. And I worked with a soil scientist for part of this project who said that these levels of land use should actually be the inverse if they're going to be sustainable, particularly the ones in Ngalaba. But the intensity of the land use was also most pronounced in the villages that were the most impacted by the project, in Ngalaba and Maikeri. And that was in part because of land shortages in those villages, but it was also because land was most likely to be expropriated there. And so people responded preemptively by trying to keep as much of their land under cultivation as they could. Because if your land was taken and it was fallowed, you did not get a compensation payment for it. You only got compensation if the land was being actively farmed. Because essentially what the oil companies are reimbursing is labor, it's not land. So these policies actually produced really perverse incentives from the perspective of conservation. In terms of how the fields were used, on the bottom, the 3 options are here. Prior to the start of the project, what you would see is what you see here in Bendo. Most of the fields, the default category, the dominant form of land use, is household fields, where people farm mostly for household consumption, and they farm collectively. In terms of personal fields, or fields farmed by individual farmers for cash, it was men who were able to claim land and to farm that land as personal fields, and not women. And this table doesn't show the proportion of women in these villages that farmed their own fields, but it was far lower than the 60% that was cited by the consortium a decade earlier. There were many, many women who couldn't get access to fields or who were blocked from accessing fields by their husbands and by their in-laws. One more table. We also collected data on the compensation payments that were made in these 3 villages, and this is throughout the village, not just the 80 households that I followed between 2000 and 2007. And not surprisingly, men captured most of the payments. Out of nearly 1,100 payments, men captured more than 3/4 of the payments and more than 3/4 of the cash. And what's also not shown here is that when women captured payments, they gave most of the money to the men who gave them access to land as a way to ensure that they could continue to get access to land in the future, whereas men distributed the money in much smaller payments to a much broader network of relatives. So policies are never imposed from the top down in a perfectly coherent way. They always take shape through ongoing contests in specific locations. And here, the compensation and resettlement plan deepened market-based relations. People began to relate to land and to things like trees as private property. But the plan also got molded through these ongoing contests over land and resources that preceded the project, and in which gender was really a central axis of conflict. So I just want to conclude by saying a couple of things. First, the idea that women could farm just like men, right? And that therefore the consortium's policies could be gender blind, allowed the consortium to make gender invisible. And this was part of a broader effort on the part of the consortium to distance and detach, right? So that it could move along expeditiously with its technical project, and so it could dispense with the burden of long-term recovery efforts following displacement. So making gender invisible in these private sector projects, not just in this one, but in other projects like this, is a really pragmatic move, and it's an orchestrated effort. It's not something that just happens. And then secondly, the precarious position that women in Chad are now in is captured in this transformation from the baou déné to the baou mosso. And that shift began before this project did. And so I'm not making a causal claim. I'm not suggesting that this shift was brought about by the project. But what I want to suggest is that even though the consortium described its policies as gender neutral, they had the effect of privatizing land and concentrating it in men's hands, making women increasingly dependent on men for access to land, while increasingly confining them to small trade, where it's really difficult for them to accumulate wealth.